Hello and welcome to week 4. Uh, very interesting work all this last week, and I hope you guys are following the arc of the course, which is that we start out with content, and that content you've been working for the past couple of weeks to find and to understand it and to manipulate it into something usable. And I know at this point it seems incredibly abstract, so apologies for that. But at this point, you might have looked, if any of you had used import.io to look at a site, that you'll find that most sites are just creations based on a table of information. And that information sometimes is available to you, all of it. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. But that idea that we create out of these repetitious, very somewhat loosely organized bits of stuff is integral to what the web is, which is a big repetitious bunch of data, and then you can have a ton of it, and you have to make sense of it. So what you've started by doing is taking something that you think you have interest in, meaning you can manipulate it and perhaps add to it or modify it in some way, and make something out of it. So now we're going to start to make something out of it. Last week, I wanted you to find some data, and we just explored the ways that you can get that data or content. It's out there, there's tons of it. The only real problem that you have is finding something that you're interested in. This week, we wanted to take that and we wanted to look at that data really closely and see what's going on in it and make sure that it's okay. In most of the cases, I'm finding that I don't think it's very usable the way you found it. Certainly that makes sense. You picked up a bunch of things sort of at random somewhere, maybe from a site. But I want you to make it your own. At the same time, we looked at Gestalt principles, and the reason why it might have seemed not to fit, because Gestalt is not necessarily just about design, it's about understanding pattern and meaning. And the reason why is probably illustrated right here fairly well in this table. So one thing I find is once anything gets into a table, you just kind of turn off your critical senses and assume that all these things are related because they have a name. And when you look at the names, these names have no relationship to each other. So why is that interesting? Well, if you were to sort these by alphabet, like if you were a business, you might name yourself AAA Aardvark Auto Repair. Why? Because you'd be first alphabetically. Does that make sense in the world we live in? Probably not, but this organization here is hard because the name of something is important, but there is no relationship with the names. It just so happens you have a nice, neat table here. And that goes for all of these, especially these nicely color-coded dietary options here. Well, what are the possible dietary options? So in this case, if we looked at the very first one, vegetarian, does that mean they only serve vegetarian meals? So it's really about investigating, does this make any sense? In this case, can you choose? Well, that's interesting. I guess you can't choose with these people. There's some notes. This is another very difficult thing to group and organize because this is text that like one has the word love in it. So does that mean that this is better than something that doesn't have the word love in it? That's the point of this week. And to add more fields that you feel a little bit more confident or have control over is the reason why I didn't want you to just look here at, okay, here's a bunch of numbers. So if you were to take this stuff out and just put the numbers in a column, is the highest number the best or the worst? It's hard to say. So investigating the data, looking closer into it was the reason why Gestalt is helpful. Hopefully it didn't seem too much of a stretch. A couple of interesting things. We also talked about Gestalt theory. I have a little bit of interest in telling you why we were doing Gestalt. Here's a good example, which is I'm going to do both sections at once today, but section 56, when they posted the answers to the questions, they used links to their Airtables or links to other things. So they used links. Section 55, where are you guys? Used colored post-it notes. So both of which were interesting, and I think you could I certainly did try to perceive a pattern and figure out who is answering which one because you color coded it. I thought that was really interesting, and these instincts will serve you well as we get into more visual types of displays. But this week is not about a visual display. It's actually about semantic HTML. And once again, we're going to have 2 weeks to do this. This is due the week after next. So this week is to try it out and to encounter problems and have those problems be solved so that by next week we can put some nuance to it and make sure that it works. So let's talk a little bit about semantics. So as we take a look at the goals for this week, this is another kind of a pet thing of mine, which is that people immediately, and you might have never even gone to the actual data before, people immediately go to visual design. And that could be wireframes or some way of organizing content for a human. However, I think most of the actual good stuff happens before humans ever see anything. And that's where an information architect can be really vital, which is, for one, making sure that content is good enough to be used, adding things to it that make it more usable. And that is by breaking it down into pieces, for example. I can give you an example in just a second, but the next step, I think, is semantics, and these are HTML semantics. So if you're not used to HTML, it's fairly straightforward, and that's why we're going to be doing it fairly quickly. This isn't an HTML coding class. This is a marking up content class. So I believe once you add structure using HTML to your content, you have you have basically usable information, and that usability comes often from things like Google. How does Google know what your content is? It doesn't know anything without HTML structure. So there's a great article here by Daniel Mall about content display patterns. There's also this thing called atomic design. You don't have to read all of it. This one by Daniel Mall you can, because it's really pretty good, and it explains why information architects really do need to understand and dictate these structures, because as we move along later, we'll see that our content is pretty malleable in terms of display. And display and use is sort of the second half of the class. We're going to figure out what to do with it. But the what it is part doesn't ever change. And he describes it well here. There's also, again, the atomic design. And you can see here this link also kind of shows you how things change, but actually the content stays the same. Now, if your HTML is poorly organized and poorly marked up, which most of it is, that's what we're railing against. So how do we learn to do that? There's a couple of articles here that show you the tags of interest. There's also a little cheat sheet. If you want to just look at the HTML5 tags, your job is to take your content, look at each individual piece, and figure out which tag is appropriate for it. And that is the thought process. That is exactly all you're getting judged on. You're not getting into anything else other than what tag is the most appropriate to use. And what's wonderful nowadays is there's more tags. HTML5 introduced, let's say, a good 20 or so tags to the tags that were used before, which honestly, they're not many. So if you wanted to mark up HTML prior to HTML5, there's most likely about 10 tags you can use. Now there's a whole lot of stuff in terms of classes and IDs that you could use, but the tags themselves is all I'm concerned about now. In fact, if any of you are used to HTML, unlearn what you've learned, because it's really just about marking up using the proper semantic tags. And so there's some examples here. My particular data I'll show you. You can click here to see a markup of the data that I got, or the content that I got. And feel free to copy it almost exactly. We're gonna talk a little bit, or try to introduce things like structures. At this point, this structure that you're seeing here is pretty good to start with. It's just a way to group things, and you can see it's kind of imagining it visually, even though we're not concerned about visuals. We're just concerned about grouping things into pieces. So this section, article, aside thing are interesting grouping tags. So we'll have to learn a little bit about nesting. So I've got a tutorial right over here about how to use the tool we're going to use today, which is called JS Fiddle. There's another one called CodePen. They're both pretty much the same. JS Fiddle is a little simpler. So JS Fiddle is just a place that you can code online in Share, which is the theme of the class. So once again, if you are getting not used to, and I noticed by a lot of activity on Sunday, which is you really do need to get started on this as early as possible, get something out there, get feedback, and iterate. That's the goal of this class, is not to wait till the end to start asking a lot of questions, because there's no particularly right answer. All of you have different content. All of you have varying degrees of understanding of the actual data in that set. So we might need to add more data still and work with it. So all those things I'm here to help. We're here to help each other make something more useful, but it does take a little bit of time and it does take iteration. So looking forward to this week.